Okay, so this is going to cover Chapter 8 in your book, Anxiety, Obsessive Compulsive, and Trauma and Stressor-Related Disorders. Okay, so first, talking about just the general nature of anxiety disorder. So obviously they're characterized by the experience of anxiety. So anxiety then is a reaction that people have, a response to basically thinking that something bad is going to happen in the future, right? It's like a sense of dread, something bad is going to happen and I just don't know when. So anxiety actually differs from the experience of fear. Sorry, my dog is joining us today for this video. So anxiety differs from the experience of fear. Fear is a reaction to some kind of situation where our lives are actually threatened. Okay, so it's a little bit different than anxiety, which is that future-oriented response of dread. And anxiety disorders are very, very common, super prevalent within the population. The only disorder that has a higher prevalence rate are substance use disorders. Okay, so specific types of anxiety disorders. So the first one here is called separation anxiety disorder. This is a disorder that typically happens in childhood. So we're looking at young children, and the child, whenever separated from primary caregivers, so think parents, or if there are aunts, uncles, grandparents, whoever is involved in the care of the child, that the child becomes very, very upset, inconsolable, and oftentimes they'll show really, really extreme reactions. So think, for example, maybe a child who is 7 or 8 years old goes to school and cries the entire day, and cries so much that they call the parents to come pick the child up. This is actually the #1 reason that we see with school refusal for children. So basically, children not attending school. So sometimes they'll also include in this, like, I have a stomach ache, I have a headache, I don't feel well, so I can't go to school. But oftentimes the separation anxiety is actually the root of it. Okay, so another disorder that we see with children related to anxiety, it's called selective mutism. So selective meaning that they are not mute, meaning unable to talk in every single social context. It's typically only in the school settings. So these children have normal language skills. They can use language like a typically developing child, but they will become almost completely silent in certain social situations. So if we're looking at trying to figure out what is the possible cause here, one potential root cause could be that it is anxiety. And evidence for this is that we oftentimes see selective mutism only in school settings where children are typically a lot more anxious, but then when they're in the home setting, that they go back to being able to talk and converse normally with friends and family. Okay, so specific phobias, very, very, very common. And a specific phobia is essentially some kind of irrational fear about something that is very, very specific. Okay, so that's where the name specific phobia comes from. So the level of fear that the person feels is out of proportion to the actual threat that the object, the activity, or the situation actually poses. So if you guys look at the chart that's over here, you will see, wow, a lot of people have phobias about public speaking, about heights, about animals, really, really common. Okay, so specific phobias, very, very common. Okay, so we also have something called social anxiety disorder. Sometimes you guys will see this referred to as social phobia. And the essential feature of social anxiety disorder is that the person becomes very, very anxious in any kind of social situation where his or her kind of performance might be evaluated by other people. Okay, so that is the central feature here, that it has to involve some kind of situation where other people might be watching me, other people might be judging me, and other people could presumably be kind of picking my behavior apart. So they get very, very anxious about those kinds of situations, and so then they avoid those situations. So for people who have social anxiety disorder, it can be very debilitating in the sense that they might avoid, for example, going to their college classes because in their class, perhaps maybe the professor calls on people randomly and they're so concerned that, oh my gosh, she's going to call on me one day and I'm going to be so embarrassed. I'm not going to know anything to say. Everyone's going to think I'm stupid. Oh my God, I'm just not even going to go to class. They might also avoid situations like eating in a restaurant. So eating in a restaurant would be a very anxiety-provoking situation because the person with social anxiety is thinking, everybody here is watching me. Everyone is kind of picking apart, how do I cut my food? How do I chew my food? Am I swallowing too quickly? Am I drinking too much? Am I talking too fast? So all of these things, right, that kind of center on the idea that other people are evaluating the performance. Okay, so panic disorder, another anxiety disorder. So with panic disorder, this is characterized by what are called panic attacks. So a panic attack then is basically this heightened autonomic nervous system arousal. So remember that that is the part of your nervous system that enables that fight or flight response that basically prepares you to deal with threat in the environment. So we see all of those autonomic nervous system arousal symptoms. So your heart's beating very quickly, you're short of breath, you oftentimes get very, very thirsty, you might feel really, really hot, and sometimes people have a panic attack and actually pass out as a result of the panic attack. So the hallmark then of panic disorder is that the person has recurrent, okay, so they have to have more than one panic attack to actually get the diagnosis of panic disorder. If they have just one panic attack, then they're not going to get the diagnosis of panic disorder. It has to be a recurrent problem. So with panic attacks, the interpretation piece is very important here. So essentially kind of how the person interprets the symptoms really can be very influential in determining if the person will actually develop panic disorder or if the panic attack is just an isolated incident. So if your interpretation is that, oh, this is just stress, it's no big deal, once I'm out of this stressful situation, I'm not going to feel like this anymore, more likely to have the panic attack be an isolated incident, less likely to develop panic disorder. If, however, you interpret the panic attack as, oh my God, I think I'm dying, you're more likely then to develop the full-blown panic disorder. So the cognitive component here, very, very, very important. For people who have panic disorder, oftentimes this is associated with what's called agoraphobia. So oftentimes, it's not all the time, but oftentimes we see accompanying agoraphobia with panic disorder. So agoraphobia then is essentially a fear of public spaces. That's the literal translation for it. But essentially what happens is, the individual person has a panic attack and has a panic attack oftentimes in a public space. And during the panic attack, this person thinks, oh my God, I am dying, right? And there is no one here to help me. So I'm stranded in some kind of public space. There is no one here to help me. And so then what happens is the person oftentimes starts to develop this kind of anxiety about going into public again because they're thinking, I'm going to have another panic attack and no one is going to be able to help me. No one is going to be there to help me. So in response to that kind of fear, I'm going to have a panic attack in public, no one's going to be able to help me. Sometimes what happens is people develop this agoraphobia, where they'll basically avoid public spaces entirely. So you guys can see here, you know, that they might develop a fear of being in an enclosed space. So think like an elevator or a theater, being in an open space, being outside of the home. So typically speaking, people with agoraphobia, they don't even leave their homes. They are so stricken by the possibility that if they do leave, they're going to have another panic attack and no one is going to be able to be there to help them. Okay, so our next anxiety disorder here is called generalized anxiety disorder. Oftentimes you will see this abbreviated as just GAD, so G-A-D. So with generalized anxiety disorder, it is essentially the opposite of specific phobia. So with generalized, it is general anxiety. So meaning you have spread the anxiety to multiple different things. You basically worry about everything. Okay, so you worry about everything. You worry about things like your relationships, your health status, your financial status, how you're doing at work, how are your children doing, what's going on at your gym, what's going on at the grocery store. I mean, you are worried about everything, right? Everything in your life. And the concerns that the person has, the level of worry that they have, is out of proportion to actual reality. So for example, a person who has generalized anxiety disorder might be very, very anxious, let's say, about their finances. Even though they have a considerable amount of money, they have money saved, finances are really, objectively speaking, not an issue at all, but the person with generalized anxiety disorder will still worry about those things. So people who have GAD are kind of like professional worriers. I mean, they worry about worrying, okay? So it's like a constant feature of their lives. Okay, so we're moving on then to obsessive compulsive and related disorders. So obsessive compulsive disorder, characterized by two things: obsessions and compulsions. So obsessions are these persistent ideas, persistent thoughts, persistent impulses. It's basically a kind of thought that the person kind of encounters like over and over and over and over again. Okay, so it's this very, very persistent thought. It's almost like, think about it as like, it's playing on loop in their head. It just goes on and on and on and on. And so then in response to that obsessive thinking, the person performs compulsive behaviors. So the obsession is the thought, the compulsion is the behavior. So the compulsion then is typically some kind of very ritualized, so meaning they have like a specific kind of practice that they go through. And that particular ritual, those behaviors, are in direct consequence to the obsession. So you guys can see here that there are some specific features of obsessive compulsive disorder. So first, that the rituals take a long time, and typically speaking, they fall into one of these 4 dimensions that you see here. So we see a lot of obsessive compulsive disorder where people are checking. So maybe I check the stove 10 times every single night to make sure that I turned it off. I check to make sure that my front door is locked 15 times. I get up in the middle of the night and go check my front door again, right? So you're spending a lot of time kind of checking things in the environment. A need for symmetry or order. So they want things to be kind of very meticulous and in a particular place. So I actually had a client who would get up in the middle of the night and go to the entryway rug, so the rug that was in like the entryway to their house, and he would put the fibers of the carpet in a particular like straight line order. I mean, he would spend hours doing this, and in the middle of the night it would wake him up if he thought that someone had stepped on the rug and it was messed up. Obsessions about cleanliness, so washing, this is a really big one. So fear of germs, fear of contamination, and so people will do very compulsive washing behaviors. So for example, they might wash their hands 100 times a day, and even if their hands are cracked and bleeding, they're still washing them. It's like they can't stop the thinking. They have to do the behavior. And then hoarding is also part of this too. And we'll get into hoarding a little bit more later. All right, so body dysmorphic disorder. So people who have BDD are preoccupied. They think that a particular part of their body is ugly or defective in some way. So they might, let's say, for example, focus on my nose. So I think my nose is just completely ridiculous. I hate the way that it looks. I think that it is malformed, and I do basically everything in my power to try to compensate for the fact that I think my nose is just awful. So I might, for example, be kind of constantly checking myself. Maybe I'm going to like present my hair in such a way that it minimizes my nose. Maybe I'm going to use makeup in such a way that it could minimize my nose. And I would also be getting reassurance from other people. So I'm asking other people all the time, like, hey, does my nose look okay? Like, do you think my nose looks weird today? What do you think? So you guys can probably see how that's kind of annoying. to other people, right? But for people who have BDD, they really, really, truly do believe that there is something wrong with them, right? And so it's a specific part of the body. So it makes sense then that body dysmorphic disorder is oftentimes comorbid with major depression, with social anxiety, obsessive compulsive disorder, and then eating disorders can be part of this as well. All right, so hoarding disorder. Hoarding disorder lumped in with the obsessive compulsive and related disorders. So this is seen as a compulsion, okay? So a compulsion. So remember that those are the ritualized behaviors that don't really seem to make sense, right? They don't really have any kind of rational basis in reality. So for people who have hoarding disorder, they have a very difficult time getting rid of things. And it's not just things that are valuable, right? So for example, when you guys graduate from college, you're going to want to keep that diploma, right? Like that is something that is valuable. But maybe other pieces of paper, for example, your notes from classes, you probably will get rid of that because maybe that's no longer valuable. People who have hoarding disorder, they are kind of indiscriminate. They save everything. And it can get to the point where people are, you know, kind of in situations that are very unsanitary, very dangerous to the health of them, and then also potentially to their families too. All right, so we also have what's called trichotillomania, or TRIC. Oftentimes you guys will see it abbreviated as just TRIC for short. So with trichotillomania, the person is essentially, has this very persistent urge to pull out his or her own hair. And this can be hair on your head, it can be your eyebrows. If I had facial hair, right, it could be facial hair too. It could be the hair on your arms, hair anywhere on your body. And so when you guys think about trichotillomania, it's almost like the impulse kind of builds, right? And then the person relieves the impulse by pulling their hair. So oftentimes the impulse is associated with very stressful kinds of situations. So heightened stress, they help relieve some of the stress by pulling their hair. Excoriation, this is also known as the skin-picking disorder, similar to trichotillomania in that the urge builds and then the person relieves the impulse by picking their skin. So you guys can probably guess that this particular disorder has some associated health consequences with it. So with excoriation, we're looking at, for some individuals, especially if they're kind of picking at the same skin all the time, that this can lead to things like infection.